Well, good evening. It is Thursday of Holy Week. And in the life and time of Jesus, it is April the 2nd, AD 33. And the scriptures that you can follow along with are in Matthew 26, or in Mark 14, Luke 22, and then John 13 to part of John 18. And so now we come to Thursday of Holy Week. Some churches call it Maundy Thursday, and it's Passover week. So Jesus tells the disciples to get an appropriate lamb so they can go into an upper room and they can share the Passover meal together. They're in the city of Jerusalem, and they've got a comfortable little place that they will share this meal. And later on this evening, after the meal, Jesus and the disciples journey to the Garden of Gethsemane, where he will be arrested, and then later a series of Jewish trials will begin. So as we explore this day, we should ask a few questions. Was it significant that Jesus' last week going to the cross, before he goes to the cross, occurred during Passover week? What is the relationship between Passover and the Lord's Supper? And why couldn't the Jewish leaders handle Jesus and his trial on their own? Why did they have to go to the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate? Why get the Romans involved at all? Well, the celebration of Passover was one of the greatest moments of the Jewish calendar. It was one of the highlights of the year for the Jewish people. And what they're doing at Passover is they're celebrating their deliverance from Egypt when God rescued them from the hands of Pharaoh and out of slavery in Egypt, and he set them on a road to where they will have their own land and they will govern themselves. And they were meant to exist and to live under God's leadership and to be a light among the nations. And so it's important. Passover is important because it commemorates this great victory that God has provided the Jewish people. And it was important for it to happen in Jerusalem. That's why Jewish people from all over, as they were dispersed in other countries, they would come back into the city of Jerusalem and they would go to the temple, because it was only in the temple that you could have a Passover lamb slain. That the Passover lamb was the centerpiece of the Passover meal for the whole family. And so the lamb was slain the day before Passover, and it was eaten later that evening. And just as custom had it, Jesus and the disciples, they celebrate the Passover meal together as a family, together on this particular evening on Thursday of Holy Week. And Passover, again, was not just a remembrance of what happened in the past, but also it was an anticipation of what was happening in the future. Yes, God rescued our people in the past, but God has also promised to bring about a deliverer, once and for all, a Messiah who will rescue us. And so typically what would happen during Passover is that, and more festive Jewish meals, is they would not eat at tables. Now other days, other occasions, they would recline and eat at tables, but not during Passover. Now, why? Why would they recline on the floor with pillows? That's because during the Exodus, they didn't have tables. They would lay and recline on the desert ground in the wilderness and eat there. And so lying down and eating was an expression of freedom. That there are no customary rules and rituals given to us by our slave masters. And so they were free people. And so in the Old Testament, the Jewish people ate on the desert ground in freedom. And so the disciples and Jesus, they're reclining on the floor, again, keeping with custom. And the disciples are probably in their minds wondering, looking forward to the day when Yahweh will grant freedom to his people. And so it looks backwards on the past and it looks forward to another future Exodus. But this time, a different kind of Exodus. So Jesus says at this meal that this is a new covenant. It's a new way that God will relate to his people. It's through his death and through his resurrection. And so at Passover in the year AD 33, and in this last Passover in the lifetime of Jesus, it is the last Passover meal in human history. That there is no more Passover. that this Last Supper of Jesus, before he goes to the cross, this Last Supper is fulfilled in Jesus. He is the Messiah. He is the true Savior. He is the one that God has promised. He is the deliverer they were looking for. And Jesus begins to take the elements of this Passover meal and begins to point and tell and teach the disciples how all of these things are fulfilled in him, what he has come to do. He is our rescuer. He's the one the world's been waiting for. And so he reinterprets this meal to say, guys, it's not about God doing something in the future, that this is happening right now in your midst, in your presence, that the meal is about me, Jesus says. The meal's always been about Jesus. Even long ago when they had the first Passover meal and they began to celebrate it early on annually, the meal was always pointing towards Jesus. And so when we celebrate the Lord's Supper, when we do communion, we are taking two of the elements that Jesus uses in the Passover, and he points them to his own crucifixion. He takes them and says, these things represent, this is what I've come to do. This bread that is broken and the cup of the wine being poured out is about my blood being shed for you. And so after he takes the Passover meal and he teaches the disciples with it, he does something quite unusual. He gets on his knees and on his hands, and he begins to wash the disciples' feet. It was an act of sacrificial service. I mean, after all, if we could use any words to describe the ministry of Jesus up to this point, we would say that he is a sacrificial servant. And his love towards others is not self-seeking. His love is a humble love. It's a gentle love. It's a love that is unconditional and all-consuming. And so here he is. Here's Jesus, the King of the world, and he has come to kneel before his disciples and teach them and show them his humble service. And so after he washes their feet, Jesus teaches the disciples about what it means to abide in him, what it means to grow, what it means to experience joy, what it means to persevere in times of suffering, all of which you can read in John 13 to John 17. And then after he teaches a series of teachings about the Holy Spirit and about joy and suffering, and what he does in John 17 is he follows that with a time of prayer. And he prays for his disciples. And he prays that his Father would be glorified in what's about to happen. And then also he prays for you and me. In John 17, he talks about praying for all those who will believe, who will come to faith. And that's us 2,000 years later. And so after Jesus washes their feet and after he prays, they conclude this time by singing a hymn. Probably from Psalm 113 to Psalm 118, these were called the Hallel songs. And so they would probably sing some of these psalms. And then they went out onto the Mount of Olives. And out from the Mount of Olives, Jesus takes the disciples to the Garden of Gethsemane. Now the name Gethsemane means the place of crushing. And so there he is. He with the disciples, he brings with him 11 of them because one of them is missing. And in the innermost part of Gethsemane, he brings with him Peter, James, and John, the inner circle of the three. And he begins to pray. And he's aware of the disciples' weaknesses. I mean, he's already told Peter, you're going to deny me when the time comes. You'll deny me not just one time, not just two times, but you will deny me 3 times. When at the right moment, you will turn your back on me. Of course, Peter had already rebuffed this and said there's no way. And so Jesus is praying. The disciples are asleep. Jesus says, guys, can you not stay awake with me for 1 hour and pray with me? Can you pray with me? I mean, imagine Jesus knows what lays up ahead in just a few short hours, and he's overwhelmed with grief. He's sweating light drops of blood. I mean, Jesus is praying, Father, if there's any other way, would this cup pass from me? If there's any other way to go about this business, but not my will, but thy will be done. And so he prays, the disciples are asleep. And here comes Judas, the betrayer, the traitor. Judas appears with Roman soldiers in the distance late on this Thursday evening. And he walks up to Jesus, and Jesus looks at him, and I love this. He looks at him and says, "Friend, do what you've come to do." Friend, do what you've come to do. And Judas leans in, and he gives Jesus a kiss on the cheek to identify him as the person that the Roman soldiers are to arrest. And when the Roman soldiers begin to grab hold of Jesus, that Peter pulls out his sword to defend Jesus. And he cuts off a Roman soldier's ear, and Luke tells us that soldier's name is Malchus. And Jesus rebukes Peter and says, "Peter, put up your sword. If you live by it, you'll die by it. You don't have to do this for me." And he takes the severed ear and he puts it back onto the Roman soldier's head and reattaches it. And a miracle right in front of the traitor and right in front of the very men who have come to arrest Jesus. So when Jesus was arrested late on Thursday night, a series of judicial proceedings took place early in the darkness of Friday morning. By the way, a nighttime trial was actually illegal. During the nighttime, this night in particular, there was a gathering of the Sanhedrin. As we mentioned yesterday, that the Sanhedrin was made up of 70 ruling members of Pharisees and Sadducees, and they had one leader, the high priest, and they all got together and they were interviewing Jesus and they were interrogating Jesus, and they're formulating an official charge against him. They're trying to come up with something here to actually put on the docket. And this was an unofficial proceeding because, again, it's illegal. That the Jews were forbidden to hold trials at nighttime. That dates back to the Old Testament, and because something about darkness and shadows that's untrustworthy, and so it was during this whole scene that they asked Jesus, "Are you the Son of God?" And Jesus says, "You have said that it is so. You have said that it is so. It is so. That's who I am." And they charge him with blasphemy against God, because who can put themselves on God's level? Only one person, Jesus Christ, because he's God in the flesh. And and that's all they needed to punish Jesus. However, before they can proceed to punish Jesus, it turns out that about 3 years before this Good Friday, the first ever Good Friday, Pontius Pilate had taken away the Jewish leaders' ability to execute in a capital punishment sort of way. And that was decreed from Rome. It got passed down to the local areas. And that's true here in Jerusalem. You cannot execute somebody. You cannot exercise capital punishment. It has to be done by the Roman government. That is why Pilate and the Roman government alone, that's why they got involved, because they alone can carry out capital punishment. And so previously, three or 4 years prior to this, it wouldn't have been a problem. They would have needed a Pilate. They wouldn't have needed a bothered Pilate. But that was not the case. This new law means that Pilate has to hear what's going on against Jesus. And so extremely early on Friday morning, they'll be taking Jesus to see Pilate. And that's when we will get the official verdict. Guilty or not guilty. So Thursday of Holy Week is one of the busier days of Holy Week. And as we draw even closer to Friday, it reminds us that God has made good on his promise of salvation and redemption. That God's plan is coming together. That Jesus is the fulfillment. He is the one who's going to accomplish salvation. And that salvation only comes through the breaking of his body and the shedding of Jesus' blood on the cross. And that's where we pick up tomorrow. And instead of having a devotion like this tomorrow, we're having our Good Friday service, which will be live streamed here on our Facebook page. That service is at 7 o'clock tomorrow evening. I would encourage you that if you're able to make it, we'd love to have you. It's a special time of worship and focusing on the cross, and then we'll take the Lord's Supper together, remembering the body broken and the blood shed on the cross. And but if you're unable to make it in person, we'd encourage you to watch online as we do that. 7 o'clock tomorrow evening, Good Friday, and we look forward to catching you then. Thank you and God bless.